All right, we're going to get started this morning. Thank you for joining us. I am Amy. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Amy Stout, your wellness consultant from Axion Risk Management Strategies. We've all heard about burnout and the effects it has on us and the organization since before the pandemic. And today I am honored to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Kerr. She is in the top 1% of most cited scientists in the world. She has a public health background, is a burnout survivor, and is trained to educate companies on preventing burnout. I'm going to ask that we hold questions to the end. Feel free to enter it into the chat or the Q&A, and I will manage those and address those with Jacqueline at the end of our presentation. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Jacqueline. I'm handing it to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Amy. I really am grateful. So the night before my TEDx talk aired, my inner critic, who is a Scottish witch, like one of the witches from Shakespeare's Macbeth, she swooped in on her broomstick and she called me a fraud. But she was simply reminding me of my privilege and asking me to acknowledge that as an educated, cisgendered white woman, I have not faced the daily barriers that women of color, single mums, and same-sex parents face. So why did I choose to step on this TEDx stage if my inner critic was so fearful? Well, actually, I was less afraid of her than Facebook. I only joined social media in 2021, and it terrified me. In comparison, the TEDx stage felt like a safe space to share my story, my science, and my solutions. So why is this story so important? And as leaders, I really ask you to share your stories. As you can see here, this is a model of psychological safety from the Egal-Haas-Berkeley group. And as you can see on the right here, vulnerability is especially important for leaders, and that can be part of creating psychological safety. Now, of course, if you share your struggles and no one else in the room puts up the hand to share theirs, you know you have not yet achieved psychological safety. So what is my story? I was in the top of my field. I was working a very competitive medical research environment, 2 kids at home. My son was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and I had a lot going on. I took on more leadership. And essentially one of the keys to me was noticing that I was crying on the way to work as well as on the way to home, because both places were so overwhelming. I experienced periods of suicide ideation. In my TEDx talk, I talk about writing a letter to my kids. I had, my back teeth were cracked. I had cortisol levels were high. I couldn't sleep. And so in the end, I did take a 3-month leave of absence, and I really had to reset my fight or flight system. Everything felt like danger to me, and I started to experience panic attacks. But after that leave of absence, I went back. And for the first time, I think I knew what stress was in my body, because prior to that, I had always managed it. I always ran my dog every day and worked in a field of public health and managing stress. But it wasn't until I went back after that leave of absence where I had reset my stress system, and it hit me like a truck. And then the emails that were asking about details of my research, I didn't care anymore. I became cynical. And really, that was when I decided that this job for me was not sustainable. In some ways, I felt like I ran out with my hair on fire. I blamed myself, and I very much felt like a failure. I've had a 4-year recovery period, including improv comedy. I've read hundreds of books. And then when I started to look at the intersection of the research on burnout and bias, I really understood part of my journey. So by sharing this, I can tell you that anyone can burn out, even in public health, even if you're successful. And I've learned to really be careful about my personality and what it contributes to my situations. But I've also learned how many barriers there are in the workplace that make burnout more likely. And so if you've experienced burnout, you're not alone in thinking burnout is your fault. And sometimes we feel it as failure. But when we do that, it hides the cost for our health, for our representation in the workplace, and for the workplace at large. So today I want to talk to you about the seriousness of the problem and why we can intervene earlier, and that working harder is not the answer. So obviously we've all been seeing the news and the reports around burnout, and there's some great books out there around burnout. Today, I'm going to share a little more of the science behind burnout, and also share that, for example, when someone said to me a few months before I did actually go into that leave and have that breakdown as I experienced it, somebody said, "Do you feel burned out?" And it meant nothing to me. So first, why is it so important? Obviously, I shared my story of really wanting to escape, and that would have been a desperate outcome for myself, my family, the workplace, etc. So what is the cost of burnout? Employees are less satisfied, less engaged, less productive. There's a lot of absenteeism, illness, healthcare costs are higher, but you're losing important talent, you'll lose diversity through burnout, and then that loss of innovation. Families individually lose their income. Families get damaged by this. Businesses are less profitable. And there's really a large and social economic burden of this, estimated at about $62 billion annually. So as Amy mentioned, I'm not going to take questions throughout, but I do want you to be thinking of some of the things that I would normally interact with an audience that's maybe not this large, to say, what is it that you feel, and see how that compares to what it is that I might share with you. So the first one is just to think about and write this down next to you as comparison to what I'm going to say is, what is burnout? What is burnout to you? So burnout is actually recognized by the World Health Organization, but it's not necessarily a diagnosis that you're going to get. And one of the best ways to detect it is through Dr. Maslach, and she has a burnout inventory, and that will tell you that burnout is exhaustion, really being overextended, cynical, your work no longer has meaning, or you depersonalize the people around you or the people you're caring for. Lack of productivity, and really it's more ineffectiveness. So you could be working and at the same level of productivity, but it's taking you so many more hours. And of course, we've seen this since 2021. The weekly team meetings have increased by 252%, 6 billion more emails were sent, chatting more frequently, after hours work has increased by 28%. So we really are experiencing this increase in burnout and a burnout epidemic. But of course, we're not all being diagnosed or doing this Maslach burnout inventory. So that's one of the questions. Are we really all burned out? And I think so it's important to know some people may definitely, and I did, I wore my busy badge. I wore my badge of honor as a busy person because it was related to my self-worth. But there was no honor in the experience of burnout that I had. And so I think we really have to realize that we're all struggling at some stage. And that's where we have to have compassion. Whether some are struggling more or less is not maybe the question here. So when you think about burnout, here's another one to write down for yourselves. What are some of the symptoms of burnout that you might experience? What does it look like for you? What does it look like for someone maybe that experienced it, or who are you seeing it in your employees? And what are the symptoms you think you're seeing? So I think it's really important to acknowledge those symptoms, because even though burnout and that inventory gives you a scale of where you are on a scale of burnout, I think some of the symptoms are so important because we can recognize them early. So one of the most important symptoms is resentment. So whenever you start to feel resentment, and oh my goodness, I was feeling that a great deal, and I share that in my TEDx talk with around my work and around my family, that's a really early one to know you're tipping into burnout. And when that turns to rumination, you definitely need to be paying attention to that. Some people are exhausted and tired, but some others are like tired but wired. You can't switch off your brain. I couldn't switch off my brain. And you're so invested in your work that it's so difficult to switch off. You definitely can have that feeling of being depleted, being judgmental of yourself, negative self-talk, and also falling into the suicide ideation. But one of the best frameworks that I really appreciated from Selena Barker was, I think that I'm a thoughtful, giving, achieving, hardworking, driven person. And I tipped into overthinking, overgiving, overachieving, overworking, overdrive. And that's when you experience overwhelm. And it's really hard to know when you've tipped into that point. And if we think about ourselves as the frog in boiling water, the water is being increased in temperature so gently that we don't notice it. And as I said, not until I took a 3-month leave of absence did I actually then know how to feel stress in my body at all. But I really want to highlight to you one of the consequences of burnout. And we've seen this in research in physicians. So essentially, if we consider that our brains function often on very ingrained stereotypes and bias, and for us to mitigate that bias, we have to take a lot of mental effort to do that. And what we've seen in physicians is when they're in burnout, they treat their patients with more racial bias. And then when the burnout recedes, their racial bias also recedes. So I think it's really important in this time when we are trying so much to reduce bias in the workplace and to interrupt bias, that we're less capable of doing that when we're exhausted. So what are the things that you think cause burnout? Another one to think about. What would be the first thing that you might think causes burnout in your employees or has caused it in yourself? So Dr. Maslach's conditions that lead to job burnout are work overload. That's often the one that people think about. But there's also lack of autonomy, lack of reward, injustice, lack of collegiality, and value conflicts. So as some of the HBR papers say, burnout is about your workplace, not your people. But I also think it's really about how we fit in our organizations as well. So again, this was coming from the medical field and thinking about the type of person you are and the environment that you're working in, the interpersonal nature of that environment. So what's your collegiality? Who are the people you're working with? And then what's the system you're working in? And you can very much see here when you think about physicians, they're going into their profession because they do have altruism, but also potentially unhealthy perfectionism. But then they're going into an environment where you might have then more empathetic distress, moral suffering, and to be honest, in the medical field, bullying and marginalization. And then you put those type of people in this culture, a medical culture, and there's a workplace environment of burnout and a struggling healthcare system. You can really start to see where what we bring to these environments and how those environments around us is so important. So you can think of that in your own workplace as well, and that's why it's so important that we don't offer false values to our employees, because if they're coming in because they really believe you're going to value the things that they bring, but then that environment doesn't support those values, this is really where we have this person environment fit problem. If I asked you how many roles you're playing in your life at the moment, perhaps write those down and think about that. So research from sociology, in fact, is showing us that role strain and role conflict is related to burnout. So often we have multiple roles within a job, we have multiple roles across an organization. We then have multiple roles in life that we're not actually allowed to necessarily bring into the workplace. Maybe sometimes we don't want to either. But there are also other types of burnout. There's parental burnout and there's caregiver burnout. So maybe someone's actually coming to the office already experiencing these other forms of burnout. So we really have to acknowledge the struggles we're having when we have too much on our plate and too many hats to wear. And I think one of the things we really have to acknowledge is the stress of the last few years. And for example, unfortunately, in a UK newspaper, they're trying to address America's workplace suicide epidemic. And again, other articles are showing us that COVID-19 was unfortunately the perfect vector for a mental health epidemic. As humans, we're not good with uncertainty. There was so much that was out of our control. Elevated anxiety and contagious anxiety, as we're more anxious around each other, we pass that on. Extreme moral distress during this period. We've had so much challenges of managing change, and managing change, people burn out from change management. It is just such a struggle. And in this time of struggle, we perhaps lacked social support because we were isolating. And really, this is where work-life merge. We can no longer not bring ourselves to work fully as we're working from our homes and in these remote environments. So I think it's so important to say, no wonder we're in this feeling of chronic stress. And if you feel it just more around you, with everyone you interact with in every situation, to me, it feels like we are experiencing this higher level of stress. And just as a reminder, that's what burnout is. It's chronic stress. So Freudenberger and North have this 12 phases of burnout. And really, that's what I want to also share about my story. Even though I experienced suicide ideation, that does not mean you're burnt out. There are many stages before that where you can detect burnout and do something to prevent it. And I actually added a stage 13 to this model, because if you do leave your job, and you lose your identity, and then you have no one else to blame. In my situation, I became a consultant. I could no longer blame my colleagues or my environment, the university. So my inner critic really let loose in that environment. So what I want to share about this is, first, the first stage is a compulsion to prove oneself. So many of us can be in that situation, either from family context and history, or societal pressures. And after that point, we then work harder, and then we neglect our own needs. We try and avoid conflicts. We start to revise our values. We even deny that we have problems. We withdraw. We have obvious behavioral changes. And that's when we then start to go into these stronger symptoms of cynicism, inner emptiness, depression, and burnout syndrome. So there's so many places along this pathway that you might be able to spot burnout in your colleagues, for example, with obvious behavioral changes. But I think we could address them also right at the beginning. And so again, have compassion with yourself and your colleagues at any stage of this cycle. But I also want to think about the groups that do have to reprove themselves constantly. So again, in the workplace, there are definitely devalued and marginalized groups whose promotion potential is not acknowledged, who when resumes are looked at side by side, certain groups are being picked, whether you change the name and the same with performance reviews. Men and women can be performing at the same levels, but the men's potential is rated higher. And research shows us this. So there are definitely groups in the workplace, women, mums, women of color, who are having to reprove themselves. We know about issues like the maternal wall and the motherhood penalty, where mothers are not being paid equally, where mothers are having barriers to promotion. So those types of people are having to reprove themselves. So no wonder we're then on this burnout cycle. So often employees don't know or don't want to admit they're burnt out, or like the word burnout, as it did to me, it didn't really mean anything. So I have a guide on my website too, and suggest different ways of trying to spot burnout in your employees. So one of them is observing their behaviors. Are you seeing changes in behaviors? Are they getting frustrated very easily? Do you sense resentment? Or do you sense unhealthy coping behaviors? Do you know anything about their personality type? Are they going to be the type that's a people pleaser, an overgiver, who is trying to reprove themselves all the time? Or are they from a disadvantaged group who, by the system that they're working in, are constantly having to reprove themselves? Or is it that you have those organizational environments that are contributing? So is there lack of autonomy, lack of reward, lack of fairness, lack of psychological safety? Are those things the things that might be creating burnout? So there are 4 different ways that you can start to observe that in your own environment. So one of the most important things I want to share with you is that burnout is more than overwork. We always have this image of the high achieving, overworked employee as the burnt out employee. So I've created these 6 different profiles of burnout to help you think through them more distinctly. So obviously the first one, the high achiever, is working long hours. They perhaps have inadequate stress management. They can be experiencing role strain, performance pressures, and that's leading to their burnout. But your perfectionist people pleaser, they're the ones that are really over-caring. They may have unrealistic expectations, poor boundaries, too much unpaid work. They're working harder, but they're never feeling enough. The busy lost souls are those that are maybe overthinking. They have little job satisfaction, little sense of purpose or achievement, and they're not being given any time to get into flow or to focus, and they may have values misalignment with the organization. The devalued worker are those who are overperforming. They have little autonomy, they're underpaid, they're not promoted, they are reproving their worth, they have a large number of unpaid burdensome tasks, and they could be experiencing role conflict and actually be quite cynical now about the workplace. The marginalized worker is one that's overlooked. They have no sense of belonging. They suffer daily microaggressions. There's no psychological safety. They may have even experienced institutional betrayal. They'll be cynical and they'll feel this role strain of not being able to bring their whole self to work. And then there's the fight, flight risk. These are the folks who've really gone into overwhelm. They'll maybe have physical illness symptoms, brain fog, they can't switch off. They could be defensive or combative, frustrated by small things, and they may be experiencing that desire to escape. So I really want us to think about these different types of burnout that there are, and then ask, is the solution always self-care? So as I mentioned, burnout is chronic stress. And chronic stress management is really challenging. So for example, I've worked in public health. I've done exercise and meditation interventions and solutions for groups of people. And I know from that, most people can't keep up an exercise habit for more than 6 months. And even the best meditation apps only have engaged users for about 3 months. So it's not necessarily the way to manage chronic stress. Lots of people during the pandemic said to me that their self-care, going for a walk or meeting with friends, it wasn't working anymore. And also, if you tell someone whose identity is tied to being productive to rest, it can be such a hard advice to take. So it can often go unheeded. Now, if self-care is personal development and you're developing emotional intelligence and communication and setting boundaries, then I think, yes, that's so important. But I think it's so important as leaders to be careful that how we promote self-care, because essentially you're pointing the finger at the individuals in the company, and you'll always have 3 fingers pointing back at yourself of the things that you should be thinking about as a leader or as a company to do. So it does unfairly blame the individual. It doesn't address the structural inequalities at work that can be causing burnout. And also it perpetuates social health inequalities, because you're asking people to take the time and resources to look after themselves. And that certainly is not equal. And even the availability of therapists of color, for example, is very low. So we got to be so careful about promoting self-care as the solution. Another individual approach that is quite often promoted And I have a little story about this. So when I first was trying to see how businesses were approaching burnout, I reached out to Adam Grant, who is obviously a famous writer and thinker, but he's also previously an academic. So he responded to my email, and I was saying, okay, what are the burnout models that you advise in your work? And so this is the one he returned to me, this stress resources model, which essentially is that if you can reduce the stresses and increase the resources, that will lead to reduced burnout. So, for example, you could reduce the unrealistic expectations, you could avoid stresses like unsupportive groups, and then you could ask for help, develop resilience, pay for help, exchange help. All these things are still quite difficult to do. And sometimes, do you know something's a stressor? And do you know how to communicate your needs? So this really is another individual approach. And so that's my question. Will all these individual solutions address what is really a burnout epidemic? Will it address the Great Resignation? Does it solve all the different types of burnout and the workplace conditions for burnout? And so for me, how I think about it is, what can we learn from public health to address this clearly complicated, large-scale problem that in public health we are so used to dealing with? So now we're going to start moving into the solutions. So one of the best programs that I've seen out there coming from a research background is the STAR program, which was developed at Harvard. And this is the Support, Transform, and Achieve Results. And essentially, this is focusing on saying, if you're going to try and reduce the overload problem at work, what are the behaviors you as a manager can focus on? And so that's what's so important. They focused on the behaviors, and then they asked managers to track those behaviors to know that they were working. So they're basically saying, focus less on when and where and how work happens, more on results. Acknowledge and support people's lives and priorities outside of work. Identify and reduce low-value work. Clarify what's expected. Encourage employees to share when they're feeling overloaded. Make it the default that employees decide when and where they work. Recognize that people do need concentrated time, often offline, to work effectively. And change up your own routines to show that you're fitting in personal, family, or health commitments. So I think this is a great model to follow that's come from the research. But in terms of the public health research that's out there, what we're seeing is that multi-level solutions are the ones that are going to have more impact. So, for example, if you do have a meditation app that you bring into your organization, if you also are making organizational change, the two together are going to have more impact. And there's some excellent recommendations come out, again, for clinician burnout and even preventing clinician suicide. And all of them have this multi-level approach. So that was the research I did in academia, was multi-level interventions for communities. And this was for workplaces, for schools, for neighborhoods, for retirement communities, senior centers. And in my TEDx talk, I imagine them also as like a baked Alaska, where you have these different layers. And so because we have different layers of society that influence us, we do also need different layers of society to create the change within. So when I think about it, particularly from the perspective, and I have a certain focus on particularly working mum burnout, at the individual level, I would recommend solutions such as coaching, developing reasonable expectations, and having boundaries and breaks. Breaks as mums is so important. At the family level, you do need to learn how to share these tasks and communicate your needs. And for example, I even changed my parenting style so that I was less of a micromanager. In the workplace, we're talking about autonomy, focused work hours, structured hiring and promotion, and even well-being as a key performance indicator. And then in society, we're talking about things like subsidized childcare, child tax credits, paid leave for caregivers, and even different messaging about caregiving and work, in particular that men also can take leave and be really capable caregivers instead of laughing at their caregiving roles in the world. And I'm really admiring all the athletes who are coming out and talking about their mental health. And I do think that starts to change our culture and our thinking about mental health. And so when we think about it from the equality perspective, we really do not know what to do. There's so many great pieces of advice out there about how we can create equality in the workplace. And so part of it is a question of how do we actually invest in these things and implement them regularly. So the way I see these solutions is that burnout can be in the middle of this combination of the things you're focusing on, particularly in HR, which is wellness, diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership development. And the burnout solutions can help you with all those areas. And in particular, if they are focusing at these multi-levels of individual change, team change, and organizational change. So what would multi-level change look like in your organization? So I would say to people, imagine if well-being were a key performance indicator, so that basically from the board to the break room, it was in your organization and something that you prioritized and invested in. And actually, that is exactly what the advice from the National Academy of Medicine is saying. The first thing you need to do is create the positive work environments. Now, that is reducing the work hours, having the right staffing, making all those work expectations reasonable, and having awareness. Next is really creating a positive learning environment. We have to recognize that we hadn't been through COVID before. We had a lot of learning to do there. But with our mental health crisis, we have a lot of learning to do. There's got to be new ways of working. And so part of that is creating an environment in your organization where learning and making mistakes and making progress is acceptable. There's a lot of administrative burden that can be reduced. I noticed in the US Surgeon General's report, he was talking about an organization in Hawaii that said, let's get rid of all the stupid stuff. And really looking at your organization and saying, what is no longer serving us? Again, technological solutions can be helping us. Sometimes they're also creating the problem. So being really aware of that. And then very much then at this stage, goal number 5 is providing the support to the clinicians and learners. So I think what we have to see is this is where you'd be providing sort of subsidized coaching and mental health benefits, but really the other environments have to change first. And of course, I'm going to love something like investing in research, because we really have to understand better how to do this. And so in particular, in Australia, there is a blueprint for mentally healthy workplaces. And as this image shows, it shows you all the different contextual factors. But what's the central point of their model there in Australia is that workplaces are engaged in a continuous improvement cycle for mental health. So I think that's so important. And one of the ways we can do that is through these techniques and processes called learning collaboratives, where essentially you're building experiments within your organization, and then you're doing these plan, do, study, act cycles where you're learning and experimenting and adapting, because what you might find works for one unit in your organization may need some adaptation for the other. And part of that process is that you're supporting each other in this change. So let's just go back to those different groups and look at individual, team, and organizational solutions for each of those. So if you have the high overachiever, individual solutions are going to be healthy coping behaviors, hobbies, time management, potentially vacation, and asking for help. So I'm just going to run through these, because obviously each of these are quite meaty interventions and important things to do. And I don't expect you to be able to straight away know what to do exactly. But the point is that for each of the 6 different profiles, that one, there are solutions at the individual, team, and organizational level, but 2, that each profile has slightly different solutions. So at the team level, for someone who's an overachiever, this is where you'd be putting up institutional guardrails, showing people their upper limits, really messaging more is not better, and focusing on impact, not process or performance. And here at the organizational level, well-being as a KPI, prioritizing the most impactful well-being interventions, rewarding team well-being, and tracking thriving would be things you could do. For the perfectionist people pleasers, the individual solutions can be around finding a mediocre filter, setting boundaries, saying no, taking breaks, communicating needs. But at the team level, the unpaid housework needs to be tracked and distributed equitably. You've got to reward collaborative leadership, and also as a leader, give permission and role model doing less. And some of the organizational solutions that could help this group are subsidized childcare, no self-appraisals for promotion, because those definitely disadvantage certain groups, and really having a mission and values focused on caring and collaboration. For the busy lost souls, uninterrupted time, values assessment, rating their enjoyment, and being able to connect to a purpose is so important. And this group might need some help reducing social media scrolling. And the team solutions here are no meeting Fridays, providing flex time, job crafting, and job satisfaction tracking. And the organizational solutions here would be things like 4-day weeks, 6-hour days, times when the whole organization shuts down so everyone can switch off, and really impact and mission-focused performance criteria. And in the recent Asana US Anatomy of Work, they have some great advice on how you actually have really good meeting guidelines and turning off those notifications that might be interrupting, having clear start and finish times, and synchronizing the office and home days to maximize the benefit of each. For those devalued workers, we're thinking about the choice, getting back choice and control, saying no, focusing on their unique strengths, their self-promotion skills, and potentially negotiation skills. In the team solutions are looking at unbiased performance tracking logs, autonomy through choices, and promotions based on tracked performance. And the organizational solutions here are transparent pay bands, pay equity reviews and adjustments, unbiased promotion criteria, and diverse promotional teams. For the marginalized worker, you're looking at emotional support, stress processing, trust testing, fact checking, and self-compassion. For the team solutions, really bias interruption, culturally competent communication, psychological safety, and trauma-informed leadership. And banning non-disclosure agreements, paying ERGs, having broader DEI leadership teams, and diverse decision-making teams. And for the flight fight risk group, they're really looking at therapy, leave of absence, potentially meditation, and a new life vision. And the team solutions here are the team planning to support their leave, personal check-ins, and return to work planning. And so again, the organizational solutions here are paid leave, subsidized mental health services, and potentially even job sharing. So I know that's a lot. So one way to think about it is to think about offering flexibility, focus, fairness, and purpose, and that can guide your organizational change. So if you're in burnout at the moment, I'll just take this last minute to actually go through some of these. So one of the things is to really try and unlearn those burnout habits, to understand that we're kind of addicted to working beyond hours, to checking our phones out of hours. So we really have to see that as an ingrained habit that we have to replace and break. Even as we start to take extended breaks, that can take practice because we're so used to working that we feel uncomfortable when we take these extended breaks. Investing in a coach is so important to help you to have boundaries or expectations improved. If you can start actually tracking your choices, writing down all the times you do say yes, because sometimes we're saying yes and we don't even realize it, or we haven't even been asked, and thinking about saying yes only 1 out of 10 times, tracking your activities for whether you actually are enjoying them or you're doing it out of obligation. And all these things will help you gain a sense of control and ownership over what you're doing. And again, really acknowledging that more isn't better. So if you think about all your tasks and consider doing only 1 out of 7 of them with joy. And it's really remembering that even though certain groups of us, we do have to prove ourselves more, maybe it's 2 times as much. it really isn't 10 times as much that we need to do. And that's where we go into this overperformance. And one of the most useful frameworks that helped me was thinking about protecting the asset. I kind of felt like Jason Bourne is, you are the asset in your workplace and in your family, and you need to protect yourself. And so another thing that I really, really recommend at this time, if you are in a state of burnout, is taking off any unpaid work that you're doing, any volunteering, unpaid work that you're doing. If it's not being paid, if it's not being valued, and it's not valuable to you, then that's really the first place where to start to take things off your plate. And of course, behavior change is really difficult. So I help people with behavior change, and I provide these guides to help people break it down so that each little thing that they're trying to do, they have a support system to do that. And so you can find examples of these behavior change guides, and I do them for my podcast guests as well. So essentially, I want to give time for questions now. So you can connect with me through my website. I do burnout prevention planning. I do behavior impact analysis. You can find my TEDx talk, my podcast, Overcoming Working Mom Burnout. I have lots of free resources on my website and an online course coming soon. And I very much focus on the strategic solutions. But if you also want to work with my strategic solutions and also having coaching solutions, then I also partner with the human group to provide those solutions. So I'd love to hear questions now, if Amy's able to provide some of those to me. And then I actually do have some questions for you as well. So I'd love to hear more about what burnout is looking like in your organizations, and what's motivating you to invest in burnout solutions, and what's working and not working. So I'll listen to your questions first, and then maybe we can turn to mine at the end.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline. Just so we have your website down, is it drjacquelinekerr.com?
Yes, it's at www.jacquelinekerr.com.
Okay.
Sorry, I've put the QR code there as to my website. So sorry, I didn't explain that. Thank you for that.
That's okay. Yes. So there is a question here. So how did improv comedy help you when you were going through your burnout?
Thank you so much for that question. So improv comedy is amazing. And again, I share this in my TEDx talk. The night that I actually sat down and wrote that letter to my kids, because I was so desperate, my husband had said to me, "It's not my fault you no longer have friends or hobbies." And he was so right. I was cooking dinner. I used to love cooking. It was no longer a joy. So I was like, I'm so miserable. I want to laugh, and I need to get out the house and prove that I can get away from my family and get away from work. Again, as you unbreak those habits, you have to replace them. So going to a comedy class meant I couldn't look at my email or do work during that time. So that was really helpful just in terms of the logistical change it made in my life. But then stepping onto the improv comedy stage is just so amazing. So improv comedy, the process is yes and. So you open yourself to every suggestion. And every time you think about somebody interacting with someone on an improv stage, they're giving you a gift, and you see this as a gift, and you respond to it. And so one, you have to really listen actively to other people around you. So it's a great tool for active listening. Two, you have to let go of control. You give someone else their gift, and they can decide that the gift was a small chick, or they can say it was an elephant, right? They can take it any direction they want. And the solutions that come from everybody giving their own gifts is just so much stronger and more amazing. You can make mistakes. It's the mistakes, that's where the funny happens. And also you have to be very present in that time and really paying attention. So that's great. Nothing else can be in your mind. And then finally, I actually started to realize some of the unique things that I brought, my gifts and what I could do were unique. And that was something I really needed during that burnout recovery phase, because as I say, I had very much felt like I'd lost my identity.
Oh, thank you. I love that you mentioned how present you need to be, because I think, some of these things about burnout, we're not present because we're always thinking about, what we need to be doing next, or, what we should be doing. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, another question.
And so it's like a form of mindfulness in some ways, without the necessarily the mindful practice. So I definitely recommend mindful practice. It's highly researched. It's very effective. But the first time I tried to do mindfulness, it felt like I had red ants biting every part of my body. So, again, we all respond to it slightly differently. That obviously clearly showed that I needed it, but I found my solution was in improv comedy a little better.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, another question is, we rely heavily on email to communicate internally. How do email habits contribute to burnout, and how can we use email to reduce burnout?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there's so many answers here in terms of what it is you actually need to do. So I think it's, again, thinking about email as a communication tool, but deciding way before that, what is the focus? So again, really having clear that, because for example, the Asana report is showing that we're spending almost 60% of our time working on how we work. Right. So not actually doing the work that creates the impact and the productivity, but instead working out how we work. But there comes a point where we need to just sort of set some limits on that, so that then you can focus on the actual work. So in terms of definitely the out of hours emails, reducing those as much as possible, and then essentially deciding whether a phone call or an email is the better communication for the problem. Because again, I think so much gets lost in communication through written communication that can lead to a cycle of miscommunication. So it's really about deciding what are the most important things you want to communicate about and the best tool to do that. So again, technology can be helping us, but sometimes it's getting in our way. So for me, it's much more about really saying, I'm going to have specific times. Like if we have times like on a Friday where you have no meetings and maybe no email, then you can really, really focus on flow and getting those tasks done. Because if you're being interrupted by emails, it's problematic. So quite often, I'll turn them off and put them at different times a day. And again, I've heard of people literally saying, I'll only check my emails Tuesdays and Thursdays, so don't expect a response from me. And again, these are the boundaries we have to set. It's not possible in every job to do that. But if we constantly respond to our emails and constantly have them interrupt us, that will be the expectation that everybody has of you. And that has to change.
Well, that's good. And I also know, there are emails you get because perhaps other people, the person who's sending the email may not be reading, like you might have sent an email and they may not have read it in detail. So then it's what am I supposed to do? You know what I mean? So yeah, so that's, thank you. Another question is, how do you manage up when your manager does not place a monetary value on your time?
Great question. How do you manage up when the manager does not place a monetary? Okay, so again, we can't control how other people perceive us, but we can control what we can control. And actually learning the value of my own time was so important. And this really, I learned it through partnership. So in the Fair Play system, you basically learn that your time as a mom is equally valuable as say a partner's time. And so it's really about, no matter what you get paid, an hour is an hour. We only have 24 hours in a day. And then you start to see that people are making choices about what they do with your time. If I'm choosing to do laundry or dishes in my time, then that's my choice. And you can look at other people and say, oh, they're not spending. It's not that they've got less time than you that they're not doing those things. It's that they're choosing not to. So I think that's one of the biggest things is and establishing and learning your own self-worth, regardless of what you're paid, is a real challenge. So again, I really suggest coaching to support you to do that. So first, you definitely have to be from that place where you are valuing your time, even if nobody else does. So I think there's two ways of this, also the managing up and down around this. And I'm really appreciating that the managers are the one that are sandwiched in the stress here. So they are dealing with very stressed employees. So they've been spending a lot of time doing that. And they're getting stress put on them from above. So I definitely feel for the managers in this situation. But essentially, I feel like we need to sort of sit down and because if the word burnout just isn't comfortable for people, it's really that we have to sit down and do this impact analysis. And so essentially you're sort of saying to the people that you're managing is how can we look at everything we're doing and decide what are the most important things? Because again, it's like, let's get rid of this stupid stuff. And so then managing up is the same thing, is you're not complaining about your workload, you're not complaining about lack of productivity, you're saying, me and my employees, my group, our team, we have done an impact analysis. And this is what we're noticing we're spending our time on. These are the things that we think we should prioritize. We think your priorities too. Are they the case? And so it's that way we really have to focus on it as impact and priorities. Because again, there's a certain tendency to be taking on the unpaid housework. And that's where in some ways too, we've got to start talking to each other about this. We do actually have collective power in collective action. So again, you as a unit leader, for example, could start saying, okay, I'm going to develop a way of distributing the housework equally between my team. So not just those that always put up their hand are doing it. And then reflecting that back up to your manager. Oh, we have a system of distributing housework. Can you look at it too? And trying to then establish that, because again, it's putting the pressure on you, but this is one of the things we have to role model of managers saying no, because when you're asking your employees to say no to you and also to have boundaries, you have to model them above. So it's definitely a challenging situation. And I really find that the coaches are the best group to give you perspective and permission to do that, because it takes practice. So I think that's the main thing, and just keep working on different ways of trying to get that point across.
Thank you. Okay, do employees tend to get fired when they start saying no and setting reasonable boundaries?
This is a really important point here. So there definitely is research showing the stereotypes and expectations that certain groups are serving of others, are the ones that volunteer. And certainly then you can be penalized if you don't do those things. So if the expectation is that you're from a group, you're a woman or a woman of color, and essentially you are expected to be the person that does the office housework, then you start to say no to that. There is definitely the potential for penalty. And I recognize that, and it's really important. But you're being penalized anyway. If you're doing that work, you are being penalized. You're not getting the same promotional opportunities. You're not getting the same pay. So that's really when transitioning to saying, okay, what does an organization look like that doesn't do that? And so again, it's really getting to this place of, because it's so important. If you're in burnout, it's so easy to run out the door with your hair on fire and not necessarily, you go to a different job and then you take your same problems with you. So again, anything you can do to practice and start to get control within your environment, leaving from an empowered place, is so important. But I think in this sort of situation, it's really looking for organizations and thinking about some of the suggestions I made of organizations who do respect this. And these are questions you can ask: is how do you distribute the office housework? How do you accept boundaries and saying no? So it definitely is a challenge. But actually, I've also had people in the opposite situation. They have, and this is maybe what you've read as the quiet quitting. They just start not doing it. And sadly, nobody notices because nobody values it anyway. It's not important or big to the organization. And so I definitely have had clients who have done that. They've started just doing less. They've resigned from committees, for example. They start doing less, and nobody penalizes for them because nobody actually notices. And again, that's one of the things that we imagine so much, that we are being monitored and tracked. And again, if we're doing tasks that aren't contributing to the organizational goals, then they're not necessary. So I definitely acknowledge, and thanks for that question, because there's definitely risks in that. Yeah, there is so important to start to regain control and to practice. And again, you can say no lots of times. I mean, the amount of times I've had to say no and then continue saying no and continue saying no. For example, even I was in my 3rd trimester and being told to travel, and I was like, no, my doctor won't allow it. No, my doctor won't allow it. And having to say no 3 times. So I know those situations and the struggles it is. And again, if we're setting boundaries and we feel guilty about it and we struggle to do it, as soon as we get pushback, we're gonna release. But again, part of that practice is continuing to push and learn how to set them, because it definitely takes time and it takes having a lot of support from those around you. So again, I think in this, thinking about our collegiality, about how we can give each other support and permission to start doing these behaviors, because that's the problem with the quiet quitting. Although it does work, it doesn't change anything. And so I'm saying, let's do this out loud. I remember my head of department told me she had done a year of no's. And I was like, I wish you told me that, because then I'd have had permission to do the same. But of course, in her situation, she didn't feel like she did have the safety to admit that. So even if you're not admitting it out loud, to trusted colleagues, to give them permission to do it too.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you. I think that what you're saying is a lot of us need to be empowered and have a strong sense of who we are and what we want. And perhaps some people don't know that. For example, what about the folks that may not have families, right? So they're putting everything into their work. And being, their self-worth is all tied up in their productivity and how they're achieving at work. How do you recommend that they kind of move out of that and into something, trying out new things and stepping away from something that is kind of in their core? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. And even if you do have a family, your work can be everything. Yeah. My work was everything to me. I was so passionate. I'm still so passionate. I have the privilege of working on things that I'm really passionate about. So of course it's observing, self-absorbing. And also then, if you've been brought up to want to serve others, of course it's tied to your self-worth. So there are so many things there. And I think that's one of the really important things, is that maybe our thoughts about this will not change. And our feelings about it might not even change, but our actions can change. So we can still do the behaviors that change it. So again, we can set the limits on our work hours. We can stop the email checking outside of work. And again, that's then starting to develop these new habits of doing other activities. As I say, you really have to try and replace those activities with something that is meaningful and enjoyable to you, or with groups of people that are meaning enjoyable for you. That's definitely a part of burnout recovery, is working on something meaningful with people like yourself. That can really help. So that's how we have to unlearn. We have to replace those habits, because you may always feel like your work is your value, and that can be very, very hard to change. So I mean, that's really what, again, one coach said to me. She goes, your self-belief may always be your Grand Canyon, but you can still do actions that put you in the right direction. So
that's great. Thank you. Okay.
And I'd love to, and we're kind of out of time, but if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm really looking for some case studies of successful organizations who are trying to prevent burnout. I'd love to feature your organization in my podcast. I'd love to come and study it. And again, at any stage, because I know how hard behavior change is, and how, attempts can get stalled, they can go awry. So anything I can do to see how things are going in your organization, and I can always make recommendations, but I'm really also looking to see, you know, what are the struggles that organizations are going through, because I think we need to share that and understand that better.
Yes, very much so. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll send the recording out. Are you open to sharing your deck so I can include that with the recording?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Jacqueline, for your time and all your information. It was truly so valuable. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.